This is Man Cave Classroom, in a classroom.
In a classroom.
And we're going to continue talking to you about Native Americans and Westward expansion, getting into that a little bit more. But I think it always, one of the things we said is that we probably circle back to this painting a couple of times, which is kind of interesting. Because as the United States is moving west, you see a lot of people also moving west. We talked about prospectors, we talked about farmers. We're going to look at today specifically how it's going to impact this particular group right here.
And this particular group right here.
Yeah, yep.
Can't forget about the buffalo.
Yep. But to kind of like maybe take a step back, looking at Native Americans and kind of like maybe set the stage. If you think back to
Seventh grade
land bridge, the land bridge, Native Americans crossed over that land bridge. Theorists believe because they were hunters, and then they settled all throughout North America.
Yeah, and that's the one thing when I used to teach seventh grade. It was like, although they had a common ancestor, this took place over hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Absolutely.
Some of the Native Americans settled down in central Mexico or down in South America. Those are your Inca and your Aztec. Some settled in the eastern woodlands of New York. They became your Iroquois. Right. Some in the Florida, your Seminoles. So every Native American tribe settled in a different area, therefore learned to adapt to their environment and lived off of that environment.
And environment dictated everything.
Yep.
The type of shelter, what you ate, how you lived. Environment was everything.
Your religion, your clothing,
your
everything.
religion, your clothing, everything. So since you talked about all of these different Native American groups that wound up developing throughout the United States, long time, way before the Europeans came over here, and you had the permanent colonies on the east coast of the United States, way before. So with that in mind, when we talk about the North America and particularly the United States being inhabited by indigenous people or Native Americans, then you insert Andrew Jackson. I mean, of course, there was a couple of other things that took place beforehand when you're looking at Europeans and the white colonists and Native Americans, but let's specifically focus on him because that's kind of fresh on our minds.
Yeah, you can do the whole the Pilgrims and the Native Americans got along.
Right.
Well, they did for a little while.
Right.
Then the Pilgrims killed them all.
But I mean, there are a lot of horrible things that happened to the Native Americans, but since this should be fresh in your memory because you covered it last year, hopefully you're thinking at this point Trail of Tears, where you had Native Americans living in the southeast, almost the northeast, southeast portion of the United States were pushed further and further west.
Forcibly. They actually sued Andrew Jackson and won the case in the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was like, yeah, Andrew Jackson, you can't forcibly remove these people from their land. And I'm paraphrasing the quote here, but Andrew Jackson was like, the Supreme Court made the decision, now let me see them try to enforce it. So the Indian Removal Act, he's going to forcibly remove these 5 Native American tribes from the southeastern portion of the United States into the Indian Territory, what is now the modern state of Oklahoma.
Now, since you always find little facts and things in there, do you happen to know any of the mileage involved?
I forget exactly because the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek, they kind of went willingly. It was the Cherokee who didn't.
Right.
And I mean, we're talking 600-700 miles.
Yeah.
And the United States Army, who was in charge of transporting them, purposely didn't take the easiest routes.
Right.
They purposely didn't leave at the best time of year to leave, so they're leaving in the winter. A lot of the elderly, a lot of the young, the infirm are not going to survive this trail. I
mean, the reason I ask what the mileage is because I'm sure some of us have watched the New York City Marathon on TV. You're talking about a 26.2 mile race. I mean, granted, they're not running, the marathon runners are running, whatever, I get it. However, along that marathon route, you had people giving them water, maybe half a banana or some chews or whatever to keep them going. Here, what Mr. Cogan was just saying is that, they were choosing the harshest routes. So I'm guessing, water stops, not frequent.
Nope.
So this was pretty horrible. Which brings us to, when we're getting into the curriculum, which gets us further into westward expansion. And of course, when we talk about environment and structures, the Native American groups out there, particularly the Navajo, they had to rely particularly on their environment. So,
yeah, we're talking here about the Great Plains.
Oh, you have. Oh,
I
that's
got one.
Yeah,
I got a clicker now.
Yeah.
We're talking mostly about the Great Plain Native Americans. those that are going to, basically the buffalo is everything to them.
Absolutely.
You know, and original 13 colonies, these are the first Native American tribes to be impacted by the United States and our policies. And as we slowly move out west, the next major group is going to be those of the Great Plains.
And they get further,
Yeah.
as they start to develop more, absolutely push up their land. So since you're bringing up the buffalo, let's go to them and we can talk about how, I always think this is pretty cool. I think you had a cool one. All right, never mind. But when you look at the uses, when you talk about how it's used for everything, of course the obvious comes up. The meat, the bones, the skin, they're all particularly used. But when we get into how clever they are, the bladder as a waterproof bag.
It was their
for
canteen.
the EUs.
It was their canteen.
The
like
tail,
everything.
Yeah.
The poop
Right.
was used for firewood. You're in the Great Plains. There's not a lot of trees around. And those trees and that wood that they do have was usually used for the poles in supporting their teepees.
Yeah, absolutely.
They didn't want to burn this. So collecting what I think the pioneers referred to them as buffalo chips.
Right.
But collecting the buffalo manure, because buffalo eat grass. It sounds gross, but that when they poop it out, it dries up and it is flammable. But everything was used.
So when we go back to the structure itself, I just realized this is why I put it in here. If you think about this is a teepee. And usually, when we're in class, we go, okay, well, what kind of, is this a permanent structure or a temporary one? And when you think about permanent structures like your homes versus temporary ones, this would be a temporary one, because if you go to like Sports Authority or whatever the case may be, this is very, very similar to a tent. You'd set it up, you'd break it down, again, and why are they setting up and breaking down their structures? It's because they're following the buffalo. That was how they survived for everything.
Mm-hmm.
The canteen bottle, canteen or water jug that you referred to, the hoofs, the hides, the horns, the meat, the skull, everything. When it came to that, right, as we start to move out west.
But then the white man comes.
Yep. Now, when it comes to that, and we're looking at the buffalo population, of course, we have the Transcontinental Railroad being out there. And of course, you start seeing this image here. This is going to affect the buffalo population. And then another thing right here that you notice, I should have used yours, your picture. Yeah, all right, that's a my bad, okay. But if you look right here, and we'll zoom in on this, is that now you have people shooting at them. And the thing with the buffalo is this, when we look at how the Native Americans used the buffalo and how they treated it, here is another picture showing you a little bit of a different way that the white settlers valued the buffalo.
It's a trophy.
Yeah.
It's a trophy. If you've ever been to Sagamore Hill,
Yep.
Teddy Roosevelt's home in Oyster Bay. He has countless head of the animals that he had hunted over his life. He was a huge hunter. It was, hey, I shot a buffalo, I killed it, taxidermied it, boom, it's up on my wall, look at it.
Buffalo coats were very valuable.
Yeah.
Very, very valuable.
And the white man wasn't coming in and taking the meat, taking the bones, taking the organs, taking the brain. I think that
this would be considered a waste,
yeah.
pretty much, if you're the Native American.
They were
the
white man was literally coming in, shooting the buffalo, chopping off their head, skinning them for their hides, and then leaving the carcass to rot. Now, from a Native American perspective, one buffalo could feed a tribe
Absolutely.
for a week, 2 weeks. I don't know how big, it depends on the size of the tribe. So, we're talking about a livelihood completely being taken away. Their food, their clothing, their shelter, their tools,
Yes.
everything.
Absolutely. And then even when you look here.
The amount. Hunted to almost extinction. I think at the lowest point, there was less than 100 bison left.
Because when I was growing up, they were almost extinct.
Yeah.
They were near extinction.
Yeah.
I don't know where they're at now.
No,
they're okay.
now they're actually being raised, and you can actually buy bison meat in the supermarket because they're being raised.
But all of it had to do with people going out there and just really hunting them for sport.
Yeah.
In terms of when we tell you about the buffalo coats being very expensive, that's going to mean the demand for them is going to be really high. Somebody's going to want to pay a lot of money, so therefore, people are going to want to go out and shoot them.
So now you're a young Native American boy, girl,
Mm-hmm.
and your perspective of the quote-unquote white man
Mm-hmm.
is being shaped because
Because of your
your
experiences.
knowledge of them is these people are coming onto our land. with these gigantic machines, these monsters. They're hunting and killing our Tatanka. That's what the Sioux called them, Tatanka. They're again, food, clothing, shelter, religion. Everything was based around this. So your perspective of them is tainted.
Absolutely.
You know, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
I mean, your way of life is being destroyed.
When you think about being at that age where you're young and very impressionable,
Yes. Your way of life is being destroyed.
the way your relationships also develop as well.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look here and you're talking about people's way of life or the way they are going to look at other people in terms of the future when you're looking at kids, this brings us to the Fort Laramie Treaty. And we can kind of get into the sense that, all right, well, one way I try to explain this to kids is that, you know, when we go back to the map, right, when you go here, here's a better one, you know, you started off where all of this was once yours, and now you're getting pushed off your land.
Sorry.
What's that? Oh, dueling clips now. So you started off where all of this is once yours, right? Now you're being asked to move. Now you're being asked to move again. Now you're being asked to move again. Now imagine if like you came into this classroom and we went, hey, can you sit there? And you have all your stuff, and then you know you get comfortable. Then we go, hey, get your stuff, go sit over there, and then you get all comfortable. And you know after about like the third or fourth time, you're gonna want to fight back at this point.
And then a new student comes into the class who looks a little bit less like you
Yeah.
and a little bit more like me.
Right.
You know, so it's like, oh, can you move for them,
Right.
please? Yeah. I mean, it was just.
So with those things that we put in your head, you know, the whole being moved around a lot, where people don't appreciate, especially the Native Americans, and then how people's perception is changing when it comes to the white settlers, you're going to have Native Americans that are going to resist. And the other thing when you're talking about that as well is that, you know, when we talk about the fact that the Native Americans are being moved off their land, the United States government is using the military to do that, an organized military at that, you know, they're at a significant disadvantage, I would think, even though that they know the land, when we're talking about up against an organized military.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like every time a new settlement, new group of pioneers or homesteaders or whoever, hunters, miners, whatever, are moving out west, the Native Americans are losing their land.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, well, I'm going to go attack that group because they're taking my land away from me. Well, that group's like, hey, United States government, I'm an American citizen, I need you to come help me.
Right.
So they send out the army. You know, that only increases the tensions even more.
Absolutely.
You know, and then to protect our settlers, we're building forts all throughout Native American lands. So it's like, only so wait a minute, now you're taking away my land because, you know, this guy's coming here to build a farm, but now you're building a fort on my land. You're populating that fort with weapons, ammunitions, cannons, soldiers to protect these people who I don't want here in the first place.
So when it comes to that, since you're bringing up a fort, all right, here we have a treaty that's being signed between two parties at a fort. I think here, like, the setting of where this treaty is being organized really probably tells you something, I would say, because imagine if you're the Native Americans, you're going into this particular military fort. You know, the military would probably have, you know, I would say this advantage where, I would say psychological at least, right?
Like an intimidating factor?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, you're gonna agree to this treaty or, you know,
Look around.
look around. So, as Mr. Cogan was bringing up before, the U.S. government built a string of forts to protect settlers and miners. The U.S. government asked each Native American group to keep to a limited area. In return, they were promised them money, domestic animals, farming tools, and other goods. And I think we can delve deeper into that with the photo with the kids in a moment. When gold was discovered, you know, they were kind of forced off of it again. So anytime that land seems a little bit more profitable to white settlers of the U.S. government, the Native Americans are then forced to take another treaty that's not favorable to them.
The history of the United States with Native Americans was a repeated history of like, hey, I'm going to give this to you.
Right.
And then it's like, well, wait a minute, there's gold here. I'm going to take that away from you. Now, there's an actual phrase for this that kids know very, very well. If somebody gives you something, then only to take it away from you. Seinfeld did a really funny episode about this. Yes, but it's like you're an Indian giver. And that's actually where this phrase is developed from, because the Native Americans were like, here, we're going to give you this land. You keep there and promise to keep there, and we'll leave you alone. Oh, wow, there's gold there. No, we need that land back. It's ridiculous.
There was another way I looked at that too, and I'm glad you're bringing that up because this made me think of this. So when you look at all this land, right? All right, let's talk candy for a second. Let's talk Starburst, okay? Now, statistically speaking, and I've looked this up, so go ahead and judge me. The flavor that is the least desirable one in Starbursts,
Pink.
yellow.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. I would have said pink.
Yellow. So now, if they're like us, I know you've done this too, because if I've done it, you're going to judge me for a second and go, no, wait a minute, I've done it too. So if I have Starbursts, and then, when I was a kid or last week, and somebody wants one, like, for example, I don't know, my brother, I'm like, yeah, you can have one. What am I going to give him?
Yellow.
I'm going to give him the least desired one that I don't like. So I'm going to give him the yellow one. So it's, wow, thanks, the yellow one. So I bring up the Starburst because when you look at the U.S. government pushing the Native Americans off of their land, the United States government is not going to give the Native Americans fertile land
By a
that's suitable
river
for farming,
where they can irrigate their crops.
or there's the possibility of locating gold.
Yeah.
The United States government is going to give them the yellow Starburst. They're
And
gonna,
it's almost similar to like what they did to the Chinese miners on the mining frontier.
absolutely.
You're like, oh, you can go work the least desirable plot of mining land.
Right, the tailing plot.
Yes.
Yes. So when we look here, this really tells you something.
I usually start with this one.
You start with that one?
And I talk to my students about the differences between
Yeah.
these two men.
Absolutely.
And it's like, they're like, well, this one's dressed in a suit, this one's clearly Native American with earrings and this, that, and the other thing. And I say, look at the skin tones.
Right.
And they're like, oh yeah, this one's a lot darker, this one's a lot lighter. And it's like, and then it's like, this is the same person.
Wow.
It's literally the same person. And the kids were like, well, why? And it's like, well, would bathing have been a high priority among Native Americans? It wasn't really part of their culture. They didn't have showers and baths in their teeth. Maybe they jumped in a river or a lake to bathe themselves, but it was like, yeah, they were significantly dirtier. And like, then we get into why this guy ends up looking like this. We start to get into now an actual school in Pennsylvania that was created by the United States government to, quote, kill the Indian, but save the man. That we wanted to kill the savage inside of Native Americans and make them more like us. And it's this is the Carlisle School here. The first class, I think, had like 80 something children, and they brought children in.
Have you been there? Because I know you go to Pennsylvania a lot.
No, I have not.
Okay.
I have not been there. And here they are. When they arrive, Native Americans, their long hair, their Native American clothes, and here they are when they're getting ready to graduate. They all look like they're good little Americans. Here are the men, hats, three-piece suit, bow ties, ties. Here's an actual football team there. Teaching them about Jesus. Why would they do that?
Well, they want to convert them.
Converting them to Christianity. Again, going back to like 7th grade curriculum.
When you're talking about the gold, God, and glory with the Spanish explorers, that whole idea of trying to convert the Native Americans over to Christianity, that's not just a 1500s or 1400s idea that the Spanish brought over.
TV show Into the West, well, on TNT or TBS about 2 years ago, and they actually have a whole episode about the Carlisle School.
Wow.
And how like the children who were brought there were like trying to run away. Some were actually trying to kill themselves because of what was going on in them. Women being taught to sew, women being taught to do laundry. Again, this was not the typical role of Native American women. Native American women were revered in their culture.
Absolutely.
In the Iroquois culture, women were the leaders.
They were the sachems.
They had the right to vote.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, they did vote for the men to be the sachems, but like men didn't have the right to vote in Iroquois society.
Now,
it was the women.
You're bringing up a really good point here because this sometimes happens when students bring this up, and I don't think it's an intentional thing too. But whether or not as you're going, when you're bringing up the fact that these three are the same thing, and you go, well, what happened? And you say, oh, sometimes a student will go, oh, they became more civilized over here. Now that term itself, that expression itself, I don't think they're using it properly when it does come out. I don't know if you've encountered it, but
right.
when you're talking about the whole idea of being civilized, we pushed them off their land, we're trying to kill their culture, it's almost like, well, how could you say that they were uncivilized where their women have political power or the ability to vote?
And we're still
right
70 years away
right.
from women gaining the right to vote at this particular point.
And you bring up the Iroquois, the League of Iroquois, League of Nations. We'll get to that. A lot of this whole where we identified them as primitive or uncivilized. Some of these ideas took shape in our society, and even in our government.
And this is where you bring up a historical thinking vocabulary word of what we've referred to as perspective.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
we were thinking that they were uncivilized from our perspective because they weren't Christian, they
Right.
didn't speak English, they didn't wear our clothes. You know, so this entire school is created. Women learning how to do laundry, because in the European, Americanized culture, that was the typical role of women. You know, when I taught, it was to cook, to clean, and to care for the children. That was the traditional role of women in the United States, really until the turn of the 20th century. So again, I mean, this is that Carlisle School, just some notes.
And again, you know, a lot of this, you know, when you're talking about what we're doing, I mean, we're mentioning the fact that they were trying to convert them to Christianity, but when we're looking at the fact that you had a lot of Native American groups, particularly out west, they were moving around hunting the buffalo. So that buffalo population is going to go down, but the other reason why we're doing this as well is that we want to teach them how to farm. We want to teach them how to farm because we want them to stay put. We don't want them wandering around. So that's where you get these reservations that were set up. So when we look at certain things that they did, we did establish a peace with them for a while. They were urged to settle down as farmers. Now again, when we talk about urging down to settle as farmers, they're not getting ideal land, ideal conditions. And here's the other thing, farming is not part of their culture. So if you're not good at something and now all of a sudden you're expected to thrive in conditions that are not great or suitable for you, you're not gonna do that well. Northern Plains people were signed the treaty to live on these reservations. And again, you know, even though it says here that the treaty was signed, almost indicating or thinking
We
in
kept
your
going
head,
back on it. We kept going back on it.
we would go back on it.
And back on it.
And then the other thing was, is that did they really have a choice?
Nope.
Save this for a separate